Hello, my name is Mike Vinsel, and today I'm going to continue reading my book, Travels with Nobody. Stephen Stroh recalls America in the early 1980s. All right, and so last week I began chapter 20, which begins on page 338, but it's a very long chapter. So halfway through it, I stopped, and I'm going to pick that up now. And in the last video that has the first half of chapter 20, when I was ending that, I said, I referred to it as chapter 19. That was a mistake. It's we're working on chapter 20 now, and this is just about halfway through. So I'm going to pick up at page 356 at the bottom of that page. That's where I left off. So I'm going to read the last paragraph that I read last week, and then we'll pick up there. So okay, here we go. And today is September 28th, 2024. Okay. All right. Here we go. So Russell intervened, telling them about the bass I had caught the night before. The friction between Dan and me didn't ruin the evening. Ariel drove when they left. As Russell and I saw them off, I was hoping that in the morning they would have forgotten about going to Montreal with us. I said so to Russell. He agreed that it would be best without them, but he couldn't actually disinvite them. That would be too harsh. I agreed with that. The next day they had not forgotten. They would join us. I had one more full day before we would go to Montreal. So I drove downstate to visit the group of friends from my stint working at a sawmill some 6 years before in Pemichuk, New Hampshire. I called Evan Knox, one of my co-workers from those days. He would get the guys together at his house that night after work. It was a Friday night, September 14th. I arrived. Ev invited me in and handed me a beer. Carl Hodge, Jim Stevens, and Art Dixon were all there. I had last seen this crew only a few months before at trout camp at Hodge's Land on Ross Pond in Pemichuk. Well, we would camp from Friday night before opening day of trout season, the fourth Saturday in April, all through to Sunday afternoon. It was a tradition those families had kept for more than 100 years. After I had moved away from the area, while I still lived in the States, I always went back for trout camp. But now, sitting by the pond in Japan, it has been about 15 years since I've been to trout camp on Ross Pond. The TV was tuned to CNN. The updates so constant and repetitive that they had become background noise. Those guys all asked about my plans for Japan and if I was planning to come back to the States anytime soon. At that time, I had figured that I would spend 2 or 3 years in Japan, feeling that to be fair since Fusako had spent 2.5 years in my country. That was almost 20 years ago, as I write. I'm still in Japan now, and now have no plans to go back to the States, to live anyway. But at the time, that is what I thought. Somebody on CNN was talking about the need for retaliation against the Taliban government in Afghanistan for harboring the Al-Qaeda group that reports were suggesting had planned and carried out the attacks. Evan, watching the TV, said that he agreed that it was inevitable that the U.S. would have to retaliate against those bastards. "What do you think, Stomps?" he asked me. Everybody at the sawmill had a nickname. Mine had been Stomps. I said that I understood that the public would demand a response. I agreed that a strong response was necessary. But I said I was afraid that those favoring a military response might prevail. I was afraid because I recognized that the Soviets had not been successful in their invasion of Afghanistan, nor had the British before them. And if the Americans were going to invade, they had better have a good plan for how to do it, know what they wanted to achieve, and know how to get out. Some of the guys looked at me questioningly, as if it would, of course, have to be a military response. But they were not as hostile as Dan Bales had been. I wondered how well American military planners had studied what the Soviets had tried and why they had failed. By 2001, the story of the CIA arming the Mujahideen, in particular with Stinger missiles, had become common knowledge, as had that Osama bin Laden had been one of them. I figured that any nation or group wishing the Americans to fail might be expected to make use of the same covert methods. The Sawmill group was all men my age, in their late 30s at the time. They were not reflexive in responding to me. They all knew people who had been in Vietnam. They knew that I had been teaching history in Massachusetts. Jim Stevens asked me if I knew anything about what that whole Al-Qaeda thing was, and bin Laden. Hell, the only thing I know about Afghanistan is that they have great hash. Beyond that, I don't know shit. Remember Kingfish? That song? Jim said. I told them that bin Laden had gone to Afghanistan to help fight against the Soviet invasion as a mujahid. I had read in several sources, I told them, that he had been on the CIA payroll at one time in the 1980s. I told them I wasn't sure how he had become so anti-American, but radical interpretations of Islam had been seen by the CIA as useful in making the Mujahideen a cohesive force. I said it was important to remember that when the Soviets left Afghanistan, the country dissolved into civil war, and the Taliban, people who had taken that interpretation of Islam to heart, had prevailed. Bin Laden had become friends with Mohammed Omar, the leader of the Taliban government. Meanwhile, I explained, in 1990 the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. You all remember that little girl telling about Iraqi soldiers dumping babies out of their incubators? That was fake, by the way. But anyway, after the Americans had pushed the Iraqis back into Iraq, the Americans kept soldiers stationed at bases in Saudi Arabia. That was what pissed off bin Laden. He didn't like foreign troops occupying a Muslim country. That's what I told them. Stance, how the fuck do you know all this shit? Evan asked. Well, my students taught me, I said. Some fucking brilliant students you got, Art Dixon said. I never taught my teachers shit, except for that I was an asshole, Hodge added, laughing. I explained that when the U.S. Embassy bombings happened in Kenya and Tanzania, that's when we started to hear about Al-Qaeda. Then, when the USS Cole had been attacked in Yemen, my students had asked me about who these guys were. I had told them that I didn't know. So I asked my students if they could use their internet skills to find out what they could, and to teach me about it, since I was such an internet dinosaur. My students found several interesting sources, including the Al-Qaeda website itself, even an English version. We found a series of letters from bin Laden himself to George H.W. Bush, and then to President Clinton, asking that the American troops be restricted from visiting Muslim holy sites in Saudi Arabia, and later to withdraw them from the country altogether. Of course, the troops were never withdrawn. Bin Laden had said that the letters had been ignored, so he had resorted to violence. That was his excuse, anyway, I told them. We talked and drank beer for a while. Then I had to drive back to Russell's house. That had been a pleasant visit. I would miss those guys. The next day, Ariel and Dan arrived, and the four of us got on the road to Montreal. I had all my things in a backpack and a suitcase, the same backpack and suitcase that I had had on that flight from Vancouver so many years before. I had my passport and my Air Canada plane ticket from Boston to Vancouver to Nagoya, Japan. I was all set. Russell had reserved a room at a hotel on St. Catherine Street. Pete Malm was still living in Montreal. He had gotten married and settled there after college. I had talked with him on the phone, and we planned to meet for drinks. I appreciated that Russell was willing to drive the 3 hours or so that it took to get to Montreal. That was a big favor. On the ride, we managed to avoid talking about history or politics. Mostly we just listened to music. It was Russell's Saab 99. He liked to drive fast, and we were all drinking beers at Russell's insistence. That was the way he was. "Come on, Stevie, have a beer and relax," he said. For almost the whole way to the border, he was going over 80, sometimes 90 miles per hour. I had to resist the urge to suggest he slow down. I knew Russell. He was the type who would tell me not to tell him how to drive, then floor the gas. If we had been stopped, the cop would have almost certainly smelled beer. There would have been a high probability of not making it to Montreal that day, and a high probability of having to remain in the States indefinitely for court appearances, which would have changed my life forever. I worried about that, but I didn't say anything. I knew that my father would have been happy to drive me to Montreal under the circumstances. I had not asked him to. Russell had come up with the idea first. We didn't end up getting stopped. It was dark by the time the traffic came to a stop several miles before the border. I had figured that thousands of people would have had the same idea as we'd had, and it turned out to be true. We reached the back of the line of vehicles stopped in both lanes of Interstate 89. How many hours would this be? People were out of their cars, standing around, stretching. There were license plates from as far away as Florida, many from Virginia, Maryland, all the states up the eastern seaboard. At least now I didn't have to worry about us being stopped for speeding. I thought about what it would be like seeing Pete Malm again. The last time I had seen him had been 1996 at his wedding shower at his parents' house just before he got married. He had since become a professor and had 2 kids. What would he think of me now? I thought at the time, traveling with such a crew as these 3. Pete had never met Russell. Rich Sanderson had, back when I was at UNH. Rich didn't like Russell at all. True, Russell was not much of an intellect, but he had redeeming qualities. I was looking forward to seeing Pete. If it had been just Russell and me, it would be okay. I could stand up for Russell. There was nothing wrong with Ariel, but I would be embarrassed if Dan started talking as he had before. Anyway, that's what I thought about when we were standing around the Saab in the stopped traffic before the border. The Rolling Stones' Dead Flowers, the line, "I hope you won't see me in my ragged company," went through my mind. The traffic would move every few minutes, faster than I had feared. People would get back in their cars, and drive a few feet up and stop again. Stop and wait. Drive a little, stop and wait. By the end of an hour, we could see the lights of the border crossing. We had finished the beers and put the empties in the trunk by the time we got to the gate. Our turn came. The officer asked us if we were all American citizens. We were. "What is the purpose of your visit to Canada?" he asked. I explained. He waved us through. We arrived in Montreal and found our way to the hotel. We found a parking spot on the street and got out of the car, stretching and yawning. Dan had brought an American flag and placed it prominently on the shelf under the rear window, purposely on display. I asked Russell if he wanted it there. I advised him that not everybody in Montreal is an enthusiastic supporter of the United States. I could imagine some people might have seen it as a good excuse to throw a brick through the rear window. Dan was incredulous that anybody could have any objection to an American flag. How could I be so unpatriotic at a time like this? He pleaded. I left it up to Russell. Russell took it out of the window and buried it under some junk in the back seat. I didn't want to get into a debate about it, and he didn't want to have a smashed window either. We checked in at the hotel. I called Pete Mom, and we arranged a time and place at a bar in a couple hours. I called Fusako in Japan. I knew it would be about 6 in the morning there, but I had to call. She answered. I told her we had made it to Canada, and I was going to try to get a flight in the morning. She said to call when I got to Vancouver, as per the original plan. I told her I would. After the phone calls, we all went down the street and found a bar near the hotel. We sat side by side at the bar, Dan next to me, Ariel next to him, and Russell at the end. Dan was trying to persuade me that at a time like this we had to stand up for America. We all ordered beers. Then Dan sought support from the bartender. Dan told him that I had objected to displaying the American flag in the car window, that I had said someone might smash it. He said in an incredulous tone, just like the night before. Can you believe this guy? This is America, Dan said, expecting support. The bartender, burly, gray beard and mustache, looking like he was perhaps a retired hockey player, turned and placed himself squarely in front of Dan, knuckles on the bar. He lowered his face to look Dan in the eye. This is Canada, he said in a French-Canadian accent. He continued, This is not the United States. Some seconds passed. If I had seen that on the street, I would have ignored it. But now that I have heard you speak, I'd just as soon go out there and smash it myself. He turned around to the glasses of beer he'd poured, placed them on a tray, and turned around again and served them as courteously as if nothing had happened. Cheers, Dan, I said, enjoying my little victory. After a few beers, we went out to meet Pete. We found the bar, and there he was. He'd gotten a table. He gave me a big bear hug. He had grown a beard since I had last seen him. I introduced everybody, and we sat and ordered beers. It was just like old times. I knew I shouldn't have been nervous about what he would think of my friends. There was no trouble at all about that. I recalled that the last time I had been in Montreal was in 1995, when Chuck Lombardi and I had come up to see the Boston Bruins play the Canadiens at the Forum, a journey every Bruins fan was obliged to do at least once in his lifetime, until they tore down the Forum. Pete remembered. He had not gone to the game with us, but we had all hung out together on that weekend. That had been 6 years before. I asked him about his kids. He said they were fine. I knew it was just as well for us to meet at a bar. I never did meet his kids. They're grown now, as I sit by the pond, recalling this story. We talked about the terrorist attacks and what a world-changing set of events they might prove to be. I was moving to Japan. We talked about that. What would I do? Teach English, I figured. But in what capacity? I didn't know. I don't remember if it was Pete or me who said that in time we might look back to see that this was a good time to get out of the United States. One of the people I had most hit it off with in Pete's McGill days was Paul Gilmore. That was in the early 1980s. In those days, Paul lived at a fraternity house. Pete, Rich, Chuck, and I all ended up sleeping on the floor or couch there more than once. I remember the first time I woke up in the great living room of that fancy building. It was the afternoon after we'd stayed up drinking and doing mushrooms all night. Mushrooms were still legal in Canada in those days. The room was lined with plush upholstered furniture and had a great wooden desk, behind which was a grand fireplace. Above the mantelpiece were the coat of arms of the fraternity, ceremonial flags and banners and trophies. But what caught my eye, I still remember this, was a series of photographs of the fraternity members of the classes of 1914 through 1918, with their names listed at the bottom of each, with the details of their military service and deaths of those who had served in the Great War. It had struck me how many of them had served, and from the first days of the war in 1914, and how many had died. It struck me because I knew that American fraternities might have had similar pictures, but the American version would have only included those who served in 1917 and 1918. The Canadians had been in it from the beginning with the British. The opposite wall had a similar collection of photographs of the classes of 1938 through 1945. Again, the late entry of the United States into the war came to mind. It was that day, when I must have been just 18 years old, that Paul Gilmore was the first one to come downstairs as we all woke up groggy in the afternoon. He saw me looking at the pictures. He told me to wait while he made coffee. Then he came in and gave me a tour of the house, explaining the various ceremonies and commemorations the fraternity held. He also had a quite sophisticated weed-growing operation in his room. Since then, I had always enjoyed his commentary on all manner of subjects, in the many times I had visited McGill in those days. Back to September 2001, at the bar with Pete Malm, Russell, Ariel, and Dan. Pete told me that Paul still lived in Montreal, nearby. Pete called him. While waiting for Paul to answer, Pete held his hand over the receiver to whisper to me in a comical grimace that Paul didn't quite live at the fraternity house anymore. Several notches down, one might say, he said. Paul answered. Pete told him I was in town, going to fly to Japan the next morning. He handed the phone to me. Paul said he'd be at the bar in a few minutes. Less than 10 minutes later, there he was, Paul Gilmore. He joined us, and we ordered more beers. He asked if I was still growing weed. I told him that I had not done that since I had gotten married, which was true. He said he still was. He told us he had recently had a fire at a big indoor operation he'd had. Somehow he hadn't been caught. It wasn't his building. His name was not on the lease or any bills, so nothing happened to him. But he said it was a close call. I told him I was glad nothing came of it. After an hour or so, we all went to Paul's apartment. He had a 3-foot-long iguana as a pet, along with a pair of lovebirds called Ron and Keisha, after the 1980s porn stars Ron Jeremy and Keisha. These animals did not have cages. The apartment was not well furnished, but we were able to bring in chairs from other rooms and all sit in the kitchen. We had stopped at a store for beer along the way, and we each opened a bottle. There was a pile of dishes in the sink that looked to have been some days old. The conversation was pleasant enough, but after sitting in the creepy atmosphere of Paul's apartment for about 10 minutes, we decided it would be good to go out. It'd be good to go out to another bar, and so we all left. Paul came with us. It got to be late. Pete bid his goodbyes, and I saw him off at the door for a parting bear hug. I didn't know when I would see him again. The five of us remaining continued bar hopping until around 4 in the morning. I had not planned it that way, but I realized that I should have known that I wasn't going to get any sleep before I left. "Come on, Stevie, one more round," Russell would say every time. I looked like I might be thinking of calling it a night. Oh, so sorry. "Come on, Stevie, one more round," Russell would say every time I looked like I might be thinking of calling it a night. Ariel, Dan, and Paul were all in agreement. I knew Russell had intended to make a party of it, and I was okay with that. In the late hours after many drinks, Dan and I had reached a détente. "See, Stevie, alcohol irons out all wrinkles," Russell said as a toast. Paul Gilmore laughed at that one. We went back to the hotel, Paul with us. I gathered my suitcase and backpack. We all had one more beer in the room. Paul asked if it was the same suitcase and backpack as I'd had when I'd come from Vancouver those many years ago. He remembered. He'd been in one of the cars on that trip to the Niagara Falls Dead Show. It was the same backpack. Now, 57 years old, living in Japan, I still have that old backpack in my closet. Here, a 1978 Kelty Tour Pack. I don't have the suitcase anymore. I went down to the street to get a taxi to the airport. There was a chill in the air. The kind of autumn chill that outside the city would have brought frost, but in the city there was not frost. With the eastern sky just beginning to show the first hint of morning, a car approached. It was a taxi. I raised my arm and the driver pulled over. This was my second taxi ride in Montreal, reverse course of the first ride from the airport so many years ago. Same backpack. My thoughts swirled. I was drunk, tired, and on my own. Would I be able to get a flight? I did not know the answer. I feared that a ticket from a different airport would be worthless. It certainly would have been under normal circumstances. I was glad that Russell had given me the cash for the truck. If worse came to worse, I probably had enough just to buy a new ticket. It had been good to see Pete Mom. He looked good. He'd grown a beard, but besides that, it had been like nothing had changed. Paul had changed. His apartment was a shambles. I had only known him when he lived at the fraternity house, which had been downright regal. He seemed happy enough, always there with a quick-witted observation. But the iguana and the birds, Keisha and Ron, I watched the scenery go by. Would I ever be back to Montreal? The driver told me the approach to the airport was crowded, but he'd get me as close as he could. I'm going to just have a sip of coffee here. Rounding the last turn, following the signs for Aéroport Dorval, we came upon an ocean of people, sullen faces, hoods drawn against the cold, some waiting, some shuffling in the twilight. I had known that it was going to be a long shot. We got as close to the entrance as we were going to be able to. At this point, I could walk faster than the traffic. I paid the driver. As I got out, other taxis behind mine discharged their passengers as others delicately managed U-turns the same way, having just discharged theirs. A constant stream of cars and taxis dropping off people who had all had the same idea as Russell. All of the people with all of their baggage, some trim and neat with wheels, some cumbersome cardboard boxes sealed with tape, makeshift handles fastened with rope. Nobody talked. I hefted my backpack over my shoulder and waded into the crowd, suitcase in hand, shuffling my way through, toward the doors to the inside of the vast building some half-mile away. I didn't know where to go. but I knew that wherever it was, it had to be inside the building. The sun was up by the time I got to the doors and was able to get inside. Inside was just as chaotic as outside. I looked for Air Canada signs, but could hardly move in the crowd. I could see the check-in counters with their airline logos far up ahead, and there was Air Canada. There was no discernible line to the counter, just a solid crowd shuffling aimlessly. How long would it take to get to that counter? Was that even the right place to go? I didn't know. Would my ticket from Boston be worth anything? Would I have to buy a new ticket? Would I be able to buy a new ticket? What would I do if I couldn't fly at all? Would I go back to New Hampshire? Is that where I would go? Then I saw a lady in an Air Canada uniform making her way through the crowd as courteously as she could. She was obviously busy, but my sense of urgency overcame my timidity. I caught her attention as she made her way by. I had my ticket in my hand. I was going to show her that it was scheduled to leave from Boston, but before I could say anything, once she saw that Air Canada ticket, she grabbed my wrist and told me to follow her. She led me through the crowd to a counter that had a handwritten sign saying Air Canada reticketing. She told me to wait in that line and they would take care of me. Then she disappeared. I was relieved to know that at least I was in a line that I'd been instructed to be in. There appeared to be about 100 people ahead of me in this line. I was prepared to wait a couple hours, but it was still a good sign. That line moved quickly, however. Before 20 minutes had passed, I was at the counter. They hardly said a word, just took my ticket, put it in a machine, typed out a new ticket with the same destination, but with Montreal as the origin. They handed the new ticket to me, and a man told me to go through a particular door. He pointed to it, and wait for my name to be called, and to follow instructions from there. I went into the room. It was a departure gate. A man told me to put my luggage with the other luggage against the wall. He said it would be put on the same plane as me. Another man was at the boarding gate, calling out names into the microphone. As he called, the people answered and made their way into the tube to enter a plane. I was expecting a long wait, but in just 5 minutes or so, among the staccato of names, I heard my name. I went up and followed the people in front of me onto the plane. A flight attendant greeted us and told us to find a seat, working up from the back, and buckle up. The new ticket had no seat number. They were loading up planes like school buses and sending them off. When all the seats were full, the man from the boarding desk came in and shouted for us to listen up, that this plane was headed to Vancouver. Was there anybody on the plane who was not going to Vancouver? He asked. Everybody was going to Vancouver. Very good, he said. He left, and the flight attendant locked the door behind him. The plane was already moving as she secured the locking lever. We taxied out to the runway, and our plane took its place in line behind the others. One by one, the planes took off in as quick succession as they could, like bombers leaving on a mission. It was not yet 8 a.m. when we were in the air. It occurred to me that my flight from Boston had been scheduled to leave sometime after 8 o'clock. Not only had I not been delayed, I was actually ahead of schedule. It was somewhere around 10 a.m. Pacific time when we landed in Vancouver. I knew it would be around midnight in Japan, but I would have to call Fusako anyway. That was our plan. She would understand. The plane landed and taxied toward the terminal and stopped several hundred yards from the gate. A gangway truck pulled up to the left side door of the plane. Then several army trucks pulled up, and soldiers jumped out, fanning out to form 2 lines on the tarmac leading from the gangway to a door that led to the baggage claim area. As we descended the gangway onto the tarmac, we were instructed to walk between the two lines, the soldiers waving us onward. "This way, ma'am. Keep moving. No talking on the cell phone, sir. Keep moving," the soldiers said. At the baggage claim, an officer instructed us to pick up our bags as they emerged, then follow another line of soldiers onto the roof of a parking garage. I collected my backpack and suitcase, and followed. I walked a spiral walkway along the side of the round building, eventually onto the roof. There were hundreds of other people waiting on the roof. There were Red Cross tents set up for people to keep out of the sun, portable toilets, and volunteers going through the crowd distributing bottled water and sunscreen. Each airline had a table with staff to answer questions. We were advised to stay close to the table of our airlines. Periodically, airline staff would arrive holding placards with the airline logo, a flight number, and destination written on it. When we would see our flight number and destination, we would follow that person to our plane. That is how it worked. I just had to wait. But I had told Fusako that I would call her when I got to Vancouver. There were no payphones on the roof of the parking garage, and we were not allowed to leave. I couldn't call her. I just had to wait, get on the plane, and fly to Nagoya and call her when I got there. That was all I could do. I do not remember exactly what time my original flight was scheduled to leave from Vancouver, but I ended up waiting all day there on the roof. In mingling with the other people, I met a group of men about my age from New Zealand. They'd spent the summer traveling in Canada, and now they were here, trying to get back home. We all admired the order with which this crisis was being handled. In addition to the water and sunscreen, around noon, volunteers came by with trays of sandwiches. I've never forgotten one of the New Zealanders saying, while chewing on his sandwich, "You know, this wouldn't be half bad if they had beer." He was certainly right about that, we all agreed, but they didn't have beer. The hours dragged on. It was already night when the Air Canada staff appeared with my flight number. I was no longer ahead of my original schedule, but that kind of good fortune would have had been too much to expect anyway. The Air Canada lady checked our passports and tickets and showed us which forms we would have to fill out, and led us down the spiral staircase through the baggage claim out to the tarmac. I put my backpack and suitcase on the checked baggage table, and we were led in the darkness to the waiting plane. The plane was almost full. It would continue on to somewhere, I think Hong Kong. Nagoya was just a stopover. I found a seat, buckled up, and we were off. They announced that it would be a 9-hour flight to Nagoya. There is nothing I particularly remember about the flight. Perhaps I slept. I would have slept, having stayed up the night before. I do remember the approach to Nagoya, though. I had a window seat and was looking out on the blackness of the ocean. I saw the lights on land come into view. I saw a city off to the north as we approached. It had to have been Tokyo. Our flight path brought us over land some distance after that, and I could see the lights of cars on the roads. I have always liked trying to imagine the people inside the cars I see from an airplane. They don't see me and are probably not thinking about the people in the airplane above them, the plane they cannot see, after all. But I thought about them that night. I chose one car and followed it as long as I could see it. Was it a man or a woman driving? Was it a family? Probably not. It was too late at night. I pictured a man in his 40s driving home to his family from working late. Possible, I thought to myself. Probable, I concluded. The pilot announced that the pilot announced our descent into Nagoya International Airport in English. It was only in English. That seemed peculiar. What about the other people? I wondered. We landed. The plane taxied up to the terminal as the tunnel was being extended out to meet the door of the plane. The pilot announced that he'd been advised that there was only one passenger getting off at Nagoya. And he continued, "So, Stephen Stroh, we at Air Canada hope you reach your destination safely." I thanked the flight crew as they saw me off at the door of the plane. It was dark in the tunnel. The airport apparently did not normally stay open this late. A man at the gate inside led me to customs, where they checked my passport and let me enter Japan. I followed the signs to the baggage claim as directed. The building was dark except for a few lights left on for me. I was the only person in the airport who was not working. The baggage claim conveyor turned on. In a few minutes there was my backpack, and then the suitcase. Next, I had to call Fusako. I took an escalator to the main floor where there was a line of payphones. I suddenly realized that I was very tired. I needed Japanese money for the phone. I thought to myself, how could I have overlooked that simple necessity? Then I saw, amazingly, that among the few businesses still open was a currency exchange booth. I couldn't believe it. Had they been instructed to stay open until I had arrived? If so, that was a beautiful thing. I changed some money and went to the coffee shop, the only other business still open. I bought a coffee and used the change in the payphone. It was almost midnight. The phone rang a few times. Of course, Fusako must be sleeping. I would let it ring until she woke up. I was thankful that she did not yet have an answering machine. Then she answered, groggily. "Moshi moshi," she said. "Hi, Fusako, it's me. Sorry to wake you up," I said. "Oh, that's okay," she said. "So, can you get somebody to pick me up at the airport?" I asked. "Just a second." She was checking something. "You know, it's midnight here. Call me when you get to Vancouver," she said, mildly irritated. "I'm in Nagoya. I'm at the airport. I just arrived," I said. She snapped to. Oh, I see. Okay, I'll call my father. Oh, you made it. I was so worried. Oh, I love you," she said, her voice trembling. I knew that tears were welling in her eyes. "We will be there as soon as we can. It might be an hour," she said. "Okay. There's a coffee shop on the second floor of the main building. It's the only thing open. I'll be there. If it closes, I'll wait in front of it. I'm the only one here, so shout if you can't find me," I said. She acknowledged my directions and then broke down into tears of joy and relief, blubbering words of love into the phone. I also broke down into tears of joy and relief. I went up the escalator to the coffee shop. The lady who had been at the counter was now mopping the floor. I bought another coffee. I couldn't speak much Japanese, but I was able to say enough that she understood that somebody was coming to pick me up. She smiled pleasantly. "Yukuri dozo," she said. It was just about an hour later that I heard some people coming. I got my things ready, and there they were, Fusako and her father. She ran ahead of him to meet me at the top of the escalator. And when we met, she burrowed into my arms with all her might. We stood there embraced while her father waited for us at the bottom of the escalator. Toju, her father, was dressed in a jimbei, a traditional Japanese summer garment that to Western eyes would resemble pajamas, in this case with a Hawaiian shirt design. He seemed genuinely glad to see that I had arrived safely. We walked out to where he had parked the car, a white Cadillac. Fusako had not mentioned that her father owns a Cadillac. We all got in. Fusako sat in the back seat with me. Toju figured that I must be eager to have a beer after my ordeal, so along the way he stopped at a Gusto restaurant. They never close, and they have beer. We went inside. I was home. Okay, that's the end of chapter 20, I believe. Just a second. That's right, chapter 20. That's the end of chapter 20. And here's the picture. It goes, that would be modern times, us looking at, in Japan, looking at the sunset across the street. And there's the B&D drugstore there. Okay, that's from our porch. Okay, see you next time.